Hi there. I'm Mark Pennell, along with Paul Sardarelli. He's our pastor teacher at Trinity and mentor. You have a whole lot of years in schooling at Dallas Seminary. I think my favorite of all the seminaries around the country.
Well, you went to Trinity in Chicago, the branch here in Ohio. That's a really good school.
I loved it. Really, I wish I'd finished. I wanted to get a degree, but never could get around to it. Today we're on our third program on the book of Job. And this is when we're going to introduce his three friends. Now, we can joke about the fact that they were, Larry, Curly, and Moe, and to some extent they do kind of act stupid, but there's a huge devotion here that I think's really worth mentioning. And why don't you read the beginning of that?
I will. So to just bring up to speed, Job, of course, is a book about suffering, and where God is in our suffering, where we are in our suffering. And this time, the major section, the middle section of the book of Job, is the interaction between Job and his three friends. And part of our goal today is to talk about how do we help those that are suffering, or maybe in this case, how do we not help those who are suffering? And so we'll look at that. But I think it's really, really important because these guys get a lot of bad press, and they should. But it starts out really beautifully. Well, let me just read it. And let's talk a little bit about his friends, and then we'll talk a bit about some of the mistakes they made.
All right.
But listen to what it says. So, as you know, Job lost everything. It was a wager between God and Satan. As would Job's faith be proved authentic or just circumstantial? Was he worshiping the Lord out of his conscience, realistically, or just out of convenience because God has blessed him so much? And so, as it goes, like sometimes in our life, when our faith is tested, when life gets really hard, we get to see the sincerity or authenticity of our faith or the lack thereof.
Right.
That's what happened to Job. Everything except his life, basically, is taken away from him.
And he's barely holding on to life.
He really is.
He's all over skinny as, what do you call him? I wanted to say warts, but he has boils all over his skin.
Yes.
He's from the top of his head to the tip of his toes. He's a real mess.
He lost his health. He lost his family. He lost his wealth. And so that's where we find him. And again, the issue being, is this man's faith going to withstand all of this? And now to add to the story, here come his friends, called to comfort this man. So here's the story. I'm in Job chapter 2, verse 11. Now, when Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, when they heard about all this adversity that had happened to Job, each of them came from his own home. They met together to go and comfort and sympathize with him and to comfort him. When they looked from a distance, they could barely recognize him. Did you ever go in the hospital when you go to see somebody and, man, you can barely recognize him? That's what they experienced. They wept aloud, and each man tore his robe, threw dust into the air and on his head. And then I thought this was really interesting. Then they sat on the ground with him 7 days and nights, but no one spoke a word to him because they saw that his suffering was very intense.
Think about that. 7 days and 7 nights of no communication at all. Well, there is some communication, I guess. They're showing how much they love him, but which they should learn to. Well, you'll get into that in a minute about how we should keep our mouths shut, but it's really amazing. I have to ask you something. More than a couple of times in the Bible, it talks about someone tearing their clothes. What's the meaning of that? What's the purpose of that?
It's a symbol of grief. They do both the basically the ancient Near Eastern symbols of grief. One is rending your clothes, and the other is donning your head with ashes. And so they do both, and it's really a symbol of mourning, a symbol of sadness, and that's what they do here. It's a very familiar. I mean, in our situation, it might be, and they wore dark clothes or whatever else we might do in our society to don sadness with somebody. But that's what they do. And, I think this is a lesson to learn before we get into the story. When we hear that somebody's ill, when we maybe go visit them in the hospital, sometimes it's hard during COVID, maybe the most important thing to do, don't say anything. Just listen to them. And that's hard, whether it's your wife or your best friend. Sometimes the best thing to do is you don't even say a word.
Well, a lot of it, we're desperate to grab onto something that will make them feel better. And so we'll say things that a lot of times are pretty foolish, and they don't connect well with it because, you say, I know what you're going through. No, you don't. And these people are going through a hell that you can hardly imagine.
And I think your presence communicates so much more than your words. I went and visited a lady, real dear lady in the hospital the other day. I left. When I left, she just said, I am just so glad you were here. And so I don't know that I said anything real wise. It was funny. I walked in to see her and she was up eating. I was surprised that she was even doing that. So I said, I'll make up a name. I'll say, Betty, why are you here? To which she said, are you asking me that philosophically or medically?
Oh, interesting.
Yes. Well, medically. Anyway, all that to say, when I left, she said, I'm really glad you were here. Presence speaks a lot. And that's what they did here.
I have to share a real quick story, being a history buff that I am. Mark Twain and U.S. Grant were friends, and they'd go on walks together, and a lot of times Grant would stay quiet, and Twain felt like he had to fill in the voids and stuff like this. But when Grant was dying and he was on the front porch, the photographs of him showing here, Twain would show up and talk with him for only a little while because Grant couldn't talk to him. He had throat cancer. And then he'd just sit there silently.
Oh, that's sweet.
And that was his friendship.
That's very good.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Anyway.
Okay, so we go from this, which I think is a really, in a sense, a positive aspect of their friendship. They go, they're with him, they don't say anything, they just empathize with him by their presence. Right. And then we go into actually it's 3 rounds of them. This is how it goes. Each of them, Eliphaz talks, and doesn't give the greatest advice. Job responds. Bildad talks, doesn't give the best advice. Job responds. And then finally, Zophar talks, again, not real good advice, and Job has to respond. Round 1. Okay. Round 2, it gets a little bit more severe. 1 then Job, the other then Job, the third then Job. And Job is now, this poor sick man, toward the end is having to defend himself. And then the 3rd round, and it happens again. And here's the interesting thing. They say things that in a vacuum are true.
Okay.
Bad choices have consequences. Sure. That's true. The thing is, it has nothing to do with what Job's going through. Remember, this is a wager between God and Satan. And so they, in a sense, in a number of different ways, they accuse Job. I'll read you a few verses here, but they accuse Job. Well, you must be a really ungodly man because this wouldn't be happening to you if you were a righteous man. And Job just has to keep defending himself. Listen to just a few words. This is Eliphaz speaking. He says, Job, you've instructed many. Your words have steadied the one who is stumbling, but now this has happened to you. You are dismayed. Isn't your piety your confidence and the integrity of your life your hope? Consider who has perished when he's innocent. Where have the honest been destroyed? In my experience, those who plow injustice and those who sow trouble reap the same. See what he's saying? You're reaping what you sowed, right, Job. Right. You used to be a good guy, but you mustn't be anymore because I'm looking at the way you're living right now.
Which is kind of interesting to me. If they're that close of friends, they would know that's not the way he was.
They should have, yeah.
But they're grabbing at straws.
Yeah, but they're looking at the circumstances. Yeah. A good friend goes bankrupt, and immediately we think, maybe he had a gambling problem. Maybe so
irresponsible with his money.
Yep. So anyway, that's how this goes. Poor Job is needing comfort, and he's not getting it. And it gets worse and it's worse and it's worse. And I think it's a reminder to us as we read this book that our lives are important as others suffer, and yet our words can be very dangerous if we're not careful.
I remember there was something that happened, but with Amy and me, wasn't a horrible tragedy. We're still here together. But I remember somebody saying we didn't pray hard enough, and man, I wanted to punch them in the nose. That's the stupidest thing to say.
We're famous for those, right?
Why would we say something like that?
I remember when my
Make us feel guilty. I mean, we did something wrong in God's eyes, and so now we must pay.
Sue was in the hospital for quite a long time with an illness. This was many years ago, and I remember I went in to go see her, and she sat up and she said, if somebody quotes Romans 8:28 to me again, which is a truism, all things work together for the good to those that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. It's true. But in this context, the person is sick in the hospital bed. They don't need to hear that. Sue, I walk into her room and she says, if someone quotes Romans 8:28 to me again, I'm going to throw my bedpan at them.
I understand that. I think it's also something that bothers me. There's a truth to it, but at the same time, I hate it when people say it's God's will. You know, if you're going through something, it's God. Is that going to make me feel better?
Not really.
And that's kind of not altogether true. I mean, we're dealing with.
Or how about this one? I heard this at a funeral home of a child that passed away. And the person tried to comfort the grieving mother by saying, God must have wanted her more up there than you down here.
Oh, my Lord.
Yes. So
we are stupid. We are really stupid.
There are a lot of Eliphazes, Bildads, and Zophars right here in 2021 around the world. Can I give some ideas?
Sure.
Just sort of as summaries for us to talk about, for you to think about, as maybe we're called to bring comfort to those that are around us that could be suffering. Here's one. So interact with this. When comforting somebody else, don't try to answer the question, why? That's what they kept trying to do. This is why this is happening to you, Job. First of all, you don't know why. Second of all, even if you did, you know, my father died of lung cancer. For many, many years, he was a smoker. It wouldn't have done me any good when my dad got the lung cancer to say, well, you know why you got that? Because you were smoking these cigarettes. I mean, that doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any good to the crying child when their toy has fallen on the cement and broken, to explain why that the molecules of the cement were harder than the molecules of your plastic toy. And when the two met, your plastic toy shattered. That's why that happened. Now, don't you feel better?
True. It's a very good description. So why do we say just stupid things? Or are we trying to?
Why do we try to give a why?
Yeah.
Maybe because we don't know what to say. Maybe because we feel like that would be comforting. I don't know. But we try to do it over and over and over again. Those answers won't offer comfort, even if you did know.
But back to what you said that was really important. I think if you feel like you need to explain or why, so to speak, keep your mouth shut, because the person that's there with you will certainly value your silence a lot more than if you put your foot in it.
Which is my second point. When comforting somebody, listen. Just listen to them. And in Job's, for 7 days, all they did was listen quietly. Sometimes people just need to talk, or sometimes nothing needs to be said at all. Listen and listen and listen. When you're with your elderly mother and you go to, maybe she's in a nursing home somewhere, just listen to her. Don't try to solve her problems. Just listen. I tell that to husbands all the time. When you come home, or when she comes home from work or whatever, and there's a whole lot of problems, sometimes the problems are not meant to be solved right now. Sometimes you just got to listen to them, right?
Very good point.
When comforting, just listen. And that's what these guys failed to do. If they had listened to Job, they would realize that all of their presuppositions about him, that he must have fallen into sin, that this must be the consequences of his behavior, they would have learned that none of those things apply here. But they didn't know that because they weren't listening.
I got to give them credit. Yes, they do deserve a lot of what they end up having throughout history, but as you read at the beginning, they really felt for him. They wanted to help him in the most loving way.
Yeah, and then it sort of just devolved.
How did he react to all this?
In the end?
Yeah.
Well, in the end, finally, God rebukes them all.
No, I'm talking about how does he react to these three guys?
Joe, each cycle, he gets a little more angry. At one point, he finally says to them, if you would all just be quiet, for you, that would be wisdom. I mean, he lets them have it. It's pretty good.
Pretty funny.
So take that home with you. Let me give you a third principle from all of these. When comforting another person, don't use pious platitudes and Christian cliches. Ooh. In some ways, we already said what they were. For them, obedience and faithfulness brings blessing. I'm summarizing what they said. Yeah. And sin and unrighteousness brings punishment. Right. A pious platitude. This has got to be true. It's on my refrigerator magnet. It doesn't help.
No, doesn't at all. It's kind of funny. We want to be wiser than God sometimes.
Yeah.
And they were being selfish in a sort of way. Listen to me. I have the answer. Yes. I know what you should need to learn. This to me.
When we have nothing to say, just don't say anything at all. Yeah. I mean, sometimes God loves you. I guess that can be an important thing to say. God is here for you. Yeah. Sometimes reading scripture can be helpful for people that are suffering. I love to read Psalm 23 when it's appropriate to people, when they're going through a really difficult time. Psalm 23 says, yea, though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil, for God is with me, and his rod and his staff, they comfort me. At times I will either quote that or read that to somebody. I've got to make sure it's appropriate, and I've got to make sure I'm just not being the pious pastor that's giving these words. But sometimes those words of comfort, that he will never leave you or forsake you, that he is walking with you even in darkness, sometimes those can be heard and should be heard. But that's where it takes wisdom and listening and actually being in the moment with people, that you'll know if it's the right thing to say or not to say.
Kind of sad in a way that it's often read at funerals, and it's kind of too bad because they should have heard it while they were alive.
Yeah.
They don't hear it anymore. You're telling it to the people that are around. I understand, but boy, what a comforting thing to know that when you're fighting for your life, there's nothing greater than his arms open.
Indeed. And in the right moment, some of these truths are important to know. If you're a Christ follower, the thing that comes after Romans 8:28 is not only do all things work together for the good, but the good he describes is that we are being conformed to the image of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so you don't need to tell that to the person in their hospital bed, but we can rely on the truth that God is using these things for really good purposes in our lives. The ultimate purpose is to make us more like Christ. Now, in the midst of the suffering or in the hospital room, that might not be the time to say that, but to know that it's true and to bank on it is really, really important.
What confused me was he introduced, I hope we're still on the same subject, or are you going to go into the next week with it?
That's all I got, those three.
What about that fourth guy that shows up?
A fourth guy does show up.
What does that do? What does he have to do?
His name is Elihu.
All right.
And if you read some commentaries, if you read some commentaries about Elihu, he's the fourth one. Remember, we called the first three Larry, Curly, and Moe. Right. I call the fourth one Shem, because I'm still not convinced he got it correct. Many people do. He's not condemned. When God comes down hard, he comes down hard on those three guys. That guy is just sort of left hanging. And so he does have some interesting things to say. Job does not respond to him in the same way he responds to the other three. So we're not sure. Depending on who you read, Elihu either is the voice of wisdom finally, or he's just adding to the other three. I tend to think he's adding to the other three because I think as the story of Job goes, the voice of wisdom doesn't show up. We're going to deal with this next time until God speaks up.
Right.
And that's where true wisdom shows up in this story.
I agree with you. It's very cut and dry. You guys are over here and you're making a
they sort of
things.
are.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I guess you can close it, but I would just say, if you know someone that's struggling or suffering, love them, be present with them like these guys were, and just be careful. Don't assume you know the answer why. Listen a whole lot. Don't kill them with pious cliches, but a word from Christ, the hope of God, when it's appropriate, could be very beneficial at the right time. But we need to be present with those that are in pain and suffering.
Is that the reason this book was written?
I think the reason this book was written was to show that a true godly faith can overcome suffering and pain, and that the sovereignty of God prevails over all things, including our pain and our suffering.
Interesting. Next week, God has his say.
Yes.
That'll be interesting. By the way, if you've just tuned in and this is the first one you listen, go back to the first one, two programs before this one, because you have to get a whole vision of who Job is and the whole story behind it. It's fascinating, it really is. It's kind of tough for me to do it because I'm not a poetry reader, but fortunately I had some help from, some commentary. That was good. Thank you very much for joining us. Until next time.
We'll see you next time. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.